I'm Dr. Erin Keating, and this is my channel, Dr. Arinarung, where I talk about my research and my teaching, mainly to do with sort of popular cultural topics, and with a pretty hard focus on Malazan Book of the Fallen these days. Today, I'm going to talk about tables, and in particular, that table. And if you're a reader of Malazan Book of the Fallen, hopefully you know which one I mean, the Bridgeburners table. And this has been an obsession of mine since I first read the novels. And I've really wanted to make this video for quite a long time, and finally getting around to it because it's just such a great, weird table. So that being said, there's a spoiler warning, of course, up to Memories of Ice, as this is sort of where the table really appears. And I'm only on House of Chains in terms of my reread, and so I couldn't remember if it shows up later. So certainly if you know of places it shows up later in the series, please do let me know in the comments, because I'd love to take this story, if you will, a little further. But to jump into sort of what I'm going to be thinking about with this table, I'm going to be using the framework from Sara Ahmed and her discussion of queer objects, and thinking about that table, the Bridgeburner table, and specifically as a queer object. So I want to start with a definition. In queer phenomenology, Sara Ahmed is, among other things, interested in thinking through the ways that we move through the world, through space, in relation to objects and other people, and the ways that the world sort of orients us in particular ways, and we orient ourselves within the world. And I've discussed this type of orientation in some of my other videos on Malazan Book of the Fallen, so if you're interested in getting a little bit of more of that, I encourage you to watch those videos if you haven't already. But in thinking about objects in particular, Ahmed writes about how, quote, objects function as orientation devices. Now, normally they do this without our noticing them, right? Helping to shape our behavior and activity in the world, being sort of just part of the background. And for those of you who are into philosophy and possibly familiar with like the ideas of Martin Heidegger, this is similar in some ways to what he's writing about in the question concerning technology. This idea that there are some things for Heidegger's technology that sort of just frame the way we are in the world, how we behave in the world, as opposed to, say, a tool that's ready to hand that we sort of direct its action, right, in a different way. There's still an element of the tool sort of dictating things, but we're not going to go into the weeds in Heidegger. But so with Ahmed's queer phenomenology approach, she's taking sort of all of those objects and attempting to bring them out of the background, right? Both sort of what we might consider like the normal objects and queer objects. And to sort of think about this and seeing what bringing it out of the background does to our understanding of those objects, but also theorizing what happens when the objects themselves draw attention, when in some way they act against or aslant from their presumed function in the world, when they become, quote, objects that come to disturb rather than extend human action. And to give us a sort of more concrete example of this, Ahmed talks a little bit about a doorknob, right? And I'm going to quote here. So the doorknob, when it is being what it is there to do, allowing us to open the door, is just that. But when the doorknob is felt as something other than what it's supposed to do, when it comes to have a tangible quality as a cold object, even one with a personality, when objects come to life, they leave their impressions, right? So this idea that when objects do not fade into the background, when perhaps the doorknob is sticky, when the doorknob is not room temperature for some reason, when the doorknob perhaps is decorative, not even a doorknob, like all of these things that allow that object to come to life and come into our attention in particular ways. So certainly for me, and hopefully for some of those watching right now, the Bridgeburners table just left an impression. And so to lead into talking about tables, I want to quote from Ahmed one more time, because it's just, there's something about the table. And she writes, quote, "To write a story of disorientation begins with the table becoming queer." So let's talk about tables. Tables have an interesting place within society and within philosophy, right? Like their ubiquity and their just quotidianness and their particular functionalities have made them a favorite example for many philosophers in their work. And so I want to give a couple of examples of that. So for instance, think about someone like Karl Marx, right? So when Karl Marx is talking about a table, he's talking about the labor that goes into the table, he's talking about table as commodity, and he's using the table as sort of just this quintessential example to make his point. Someone like Bertrand Russell, right, who's talking about and using a table in thinking about the nature of reality and the nature of our knowledge, right, of reality and our ability to know, right? It's this idea of like, how do we know that that table is in front of us, that that table is there? And one of the big examples that Ahmed uses in her book is Husserl, the philosopher who is a phenomenologist, who spends some time writing about his writing table. And yet for Ahmed, he misses many of sort of the ways that table is sort of orienting him in the world or revealing the background, right, of Husserl's particular world. And so Ahmed writes about Husserl writing about his table to pull out the ways that the writing table has all of these implications and how it's different from other types of table and how it, for Husserl, is a certain sense of privilege, right, that he has this space that is his table where he does his work, for instance. Tables organize the space around them in particular ways. So think about the difference between a kitchen table, formal dining room table, or a writing table. And think about the ways that they actually sort of dictate behavior in that space in some particular ways, like the level of formality that might be required at sort of a dining table versus the level of formality at a kitchen table when you use those, right? When there's guests for the dining table, when it's just the family for the kitchen table potentially, right? Or even like a writing table, which is less to do about, it's actually nothing to do about sort of socializing with others, but is very much that sort of private space for work, for directing one's work. And so thinking about all of these different types of tables, and of course you could list many, many more, what I'm interested in these things is the way that they shape the behavior that happens around them, right? In particular ways, depending on their own qualities, depending on their locations. And just thinking about the ways that this background object actually organizes the space that we come into when we encounter it in particular ways. And part of this organization has to do with sort of who's invited, right? Like think about what it means to be invited to pull up a chair to a table. What is that gesture? What does that mean in that moment? And also who is excluded perhaps from that gesture as well. And all of these elements are going to come into sort of talking about tables in Malazan Book of the Fallen. And certainly if you're interested in this sort of thing and you don't have time to read a full monograph of queer phenomenology, I've linked below a blog post that Ahmed did where she talks about tables and so talks about some of these other philosophers as well as some other sort of writers and a press that uses the kitchen table as its moniker. So if you're interested in that, the link is of course below. But let's get back to Malazan. There are many tables that I would call normative tables in Malazan, by which I mean that they're tables that just quietly fulfill their function as an object. They don't draw attention to their own objecthood, but merely organize the space around them in a predictable and recognizable way if one stops to think about it, though of course the point is that one usually doesn't stop to think about it. And so before we go into the table, I want to give two examples of fairly regular tables in the novel, as it gives us a sense, a stronger sense of the particular functions that um, Erikson is drawing on in using tables, right, within this particular society, the particular connotations we might think about with these tables. Early on in Gardens of the Moon, in Pale, we have a scene in Tattersall's quarters that brings her together with Whiskey Jack, Quick Ben, Callum, and Fiddler. And at this point, she's still unsure of them, but they are gathering to discuss like Hairlock and Tattersall's desire for revenge on Taishrin. And they don't really trust each other at this point. And Tattersall's more sort of open about this, but Quick Ben and the others don't want to let her in on their full plan, right? So they're contributing to this lack of trust. As this tentative alliance is being formed, we get strategic mentions of the table around which they're gathered. So at the beginning of the scene, it's noted that everything but the, quote, larger pieces of furniture have been stripped from the rooms by their previous occupants, who of course fled the city. One of these pieces is a table that Tattersall's described as is sitting at, right along with the others. This is an important element of tables that is often used, frankly, in fantasy literature and just in literature in general, which is to bring people together physically in a structured way, to gather people around them. And of course, we don't get a lot of details about this particular table. We don't know if it's round, we don't know if it's square, we don't know how they're seated in relation to each other, but we do have that sense of gathering. They're all sitting at the table. They're all potentially open to working together, right? So it's playing on the metaphoric sort of idea of that as well as the literal. So near the end of the scene, when Tattersall's hesitating about being drawn into their plans, we get another mention of the table. And this is Whiskey Jack we're looking at here. Quote, "The sergeant fell silent, his gaze fixed on the tabletop. His impassive expression fell away, revealing a war of emotions." Immediately after this, Whiskey Jack tells Quickben to reveal part of the plan, right? So the table becomes a place that creates alliances, not just bringing people together physically within a moment, but also creating bonds between people. For Whiskey Jack, in that moment, it also becomes a neutral surface upon which to focus that allows him to both reveal emotion on his face and to make the decision to trust Tattersall at least a bit more. And so the idea is this heavy, solid table, which was unable to be removed, right, when the occupants fled, becomes the base for decision, for action, and for the extension of trust and the creation of bonds between these characters. It's this table that brings them together and it enables this. And its solidity is very important in this respect because it's almost sort of signaling the solidity of the alliance being made itself. Another table that's interesting to mention in this regard, of course, is Krupp's table at the Phoenix Inn. And as a table of regulars in a public space of sorts, this signals a group alliance to others, right? For this one, what's really important is who is allowed at the table, who is there, who is invited into the circle. If you'll recall, often you have Krupp at this table, you have Crocus, Relic Nom, Murillo, and Call. Oftentimes, Call might be actually passed out at the table. They seem to spend all night there frequently. And so this idea that this is, although it's in a public inn, this establishes their circle. And I like to think it sort of harks back as well to the gaming table, right? This idea that regardless of which rules you're using, if you're sort of tabletop gaming, it's the table that sort of brings things together. It's the table that helps to create the party in some particular ways. And so you'll note with this table that it's not like it's a spoken rule that only certain people, it's not reserved. It just becomes part of sort of the idea, the atmosphere that it is Krupp's table. And strangers very rarely sit there. One exception would be Circle Breaker at one point, but of course, Circle Breaker as an agent of the eel. Spoilers for Gardens of the Moon here. So, an agent of Krupp, it is given permission and actually told to enter that space, to offer a warning to the other characters. And think about that in contrast to when Callum enters the Phoenix Inn looking for the assassins. Like it's clear that he and Relic Nom spot each other quite quickly, being both trained assassins. And Callum stays at the bar, right? Not entering that space, not sort of approaching, sort of recognizing. And so all of this is unstated, all of this is under the surface, but it's that table that sort of is this the physical object that brings the group together in that particular way. So now that we've talked about the normative tables, sort of average regular tables, that are interesting in and of themselves, but not the reason in particular we're here. I want to look at the table, the Bridgeburner table. And I want to do that by first sort of reviewing what we know about it and going through that a little bit. The table's made by Fiddler and Hedge in Mott Woods. They can play card games, they can gamble, and it's stolen by the Mott irregulars during a battle, despite being, a 200-pound table, as we learn from Whiskey Jack. And so remember in terms of thinking about this table, so they've built it, but also it has a deck of dragons embedded between its layers, right? Like this, it's used to cheat at cards because this deck can allow Fiddler to read sort of the oppositions with the cards that are then placed on top of it, right? So it is a deck of cards within the table, already being a little strange. And this table turns up in Kaladin Brood's command camp as a donation from the Mott irregulars. And so this idea that it has come back for whatever reason, it's been placed in there. We know the Mott irregulars are actually pretty powerful warlocks, even though they pretend to be imbeciles, so we should be a little suspicious maybe of why they put this table there. But as soon as the remaining Bridgeburners realize that it's there, they steal it. And this brings us sort of to one of the functions of it that we'll get to in a moment, but they steal that. The next thing is that Silver Fox uses this table to paint the master of the deck on its underside, right? So adding to the deck that's already embedded inside the table with this new card. And if you remember this rather humorously, ruins the plans of the Bridgeburners, right? So like Hedge, Spindle, Picker and Blend, and others, remnants, to cheat others out of their money, right? So this idea that they were going to use the table after they had stolen it together to do basically, Fiddler's trick, but Spindle would be doing it of cheating at the cards in a way that no one can really be able to tell that that is what they're doing. This spectacularly backfires because of this, and they end up losing all of their money until Spindle sort of realizes, oh, there's another card under the bottom there. And so this idea that if we're thinking about this table in relation to the Bridgeburners, there is this sense that even at that point, like many of the normative tables, it's being used to create this sort of coherence in the Bridgeburners, and particularly in this case, sort of the remnants of who are left behind, right, who have now been sort of put into one unit. And both sort of the stealing it, which is a rather humorous moment, and then of course the attempt to basically fleece the other units that completely backfires, this is used for that moment. So the other thing that we have to remember about this particular table is that it also, at a very key moment in the text, flies and brings with it actually, Krupp hanging off of it in this hilarious moment. But it sort of becomes the card, it flies. At some point in this moment, right, the legs come off, we're told, once, Quick Ben then also manages to get it out of the sky at one point. But also, it sort of acts as the reveal, right? Like it's sort of flying up there. It's an announcement, if you will, that Ganos Perrin is the master of the deck. It sort of makes Perrin realize he's the master of the deck. Like he knows he's been fighting something for quite a while there, but he's not quite sure what. And so it acts as this important announcement of this new card and the fact that that card very clearly, given how Silver Fox has painted it, represents Perrin. Before we get into the implications and importance of that, the final thing, of course, is that we learn at the end of the novel, not sure why, but the Mott irregulars steal it again. And even though it doesn't have legs at this point, they still call it a table, right? So it still remains as a table for whatever reason. It doesn't actually become a card. It's just a flying table that can also be a card in particular circumstances. So it's this very sort of strange, this very queer table that has inspired this video. And I want to go a little bit more deeply into its relationship in these very strange scenes when it's drawing its attention to itself. This table demonstrates the typical traits of tablehood, right? It organizes people around it in alliances. You see that when it's acting as Kaladin Brood's, tent table. It builds bonds within the squad members as they, cheat the other squads at cards, or attempt to cheat the other squads at cards. And even the act of stealing back that table has this bonding effect on those involved. It's something that as soon as the Bridgeburners see it, they need it back. It's their table. Fiddler and Hedge made it, they built it, it's theirs. Those are the more sort of, normative aspects of the table. But unlike the table in Pale or the table in the Phoenix Inn, this table refuses to be the background, right? It refuses to stay unobtrusive. Its very size, its weight, its ugliness draws attention. And because of that, its function is really dramatically foregrounded, and even more so when it briefly acts as the master of the deck card, lending its own functionality to our understanding of Gano's Perrin's new role, right? Because if you think about it, the master of the deck will be a sort of fulcrum around whom the deck will reorganize. And he's literally sort of making decisions about who is allowed at the table when he considers whether to include the House of Chains in the deck. So this idea that this table and Perrin's role are very sort of symbolically connected in really important ways. Another way to look at this as well is that the table's ability to be more than table, right? To change the nature of its objecthood, if you will. So like for the table to be a deck, for the table to be a card, for the table to fly, which I'm not sure, there's an object, but anyway, a flying table, for it to actually be these other things and function in these unusual ways also speaks in some ways to some of Perrin's powers, right, that are revealed in the sense that he can make objects portals, right? Like we learn this very quickly, and Perrin learns this at the same time, and slowly sort of gets taught more as Quickben urges him to develop these skills. But this idea that, like the table that becomes other and that becomes in flight and that takes on these different meanings, Perrin can, say, use a space within the Azath house to travel through different ways. He can draw a card and do the same thing, right? So he can take these objects and turn them into portal. And so it's also this flexibility of object that is in the table, but is also in the figure it's announcing, which is, Perrin's master of the deck. So I feel like Erikson has this really rich relationship that is there just to be played with and thought about, and is very intentionally being brought to us by this extremely quotidian, this extremely ordinary object that, despite its ordinariness, has haunted philosophers for centuries, right? So this idea that there is this mystery and this magic in background objects, and in particular, sort of this epitome of a background object, the table. I want to conclude this in thinking about, when objects refuse to stay in the background, right? They refuse to unobtrusively serve their function, whether that is bringing people together, keeping light out at a window for hung curtains. Like when these objects do this, they destabilize our world and our worldview, right? They make us notice things that are usually at the point of assumption as opposed to notice. And while it might be easy to say, well, it's fantasy, it's just magic, it's far more fun to dig into what effect these queer objects can have, right? On the events, on the characters, within the text, and on the readers. And to think about perhaps sort of moments in our life where it really pays off, if you will, to notice those objects, to think about objects, to bring out of the background, right, the things that are organizing our daily lives, organizing our thoughts, organizing the ways we move within the world, all while we're sort of blithely imagining ourselves as just only agents acting upon the world, right? Because the thing about queer objects and using sort of queer phenomenology to talk about queer objects is that it's about noticing the way those objects orient us instead of the ways we just use them, right, in particular ways. Certainly there's lots of those queer objects in Malazan Book of the Fallen, and I probably could have done, a lot more in terms of this video, but I actually sort of wanted to leave it there, see maybe if you have some suggestions, if there's ones in particular you'd want me to dig into. In thinking about this video, I also thought a little bit about Dragnapar, right, the sword that is also the place or the warren, the gate to the warren. Also thought about potentially, the coin, Oban's coin. Also thought about the deck of dragons itself and its sort of relationship, right, to the world and in organizing the ascendants in various ways. and how that is not sort of limited. It's not just a deck of oracle cards, right? It's something very different in this universe. And so if you have suggestions, please let me know. If there's other stuff you want to sort of expound on, please feel free to do so. I would love to read it. And for now, thank you very much for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, please like, please subscribe if you haven't already. And for now, just read more Malazan.